8 kings, 241,200 years of combined reign, then 5 words carved into clay, the flood swept over. The Weld-Blundell prism, housed at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, contains the Sumerian king list, humanity's oldest historical chronicle. It describes a world before the deluge, ruled by monarchs who lived for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, kingship resumed. Reign lengths dropped. History, as we understand it, began. But here is the contradiction that haunts archaeology. When researchers excavate beneath Sumerian cities, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, they find no catastrophic break, no sterile layer marking civilization's end and rebirth. Instead, continuous occupation stretching back millennia before any proposed flood date. What actually happened during those 6,000 years between the Ice Age's end and the rise of the world's first cities? The archaeological record reveals something more remarkable than any sudden catastrophe could explain. To understand what the Sumerians believed about their own past, we must first examine the sources they left behind. The Weld-Blundell prism is the most complete version of the Sumerian king list, but it is far from the only one. Approximately 25 fragments of this composition have been discovered across multiple sites, most dating to the Old Babylonian period in the early 2nd millennium BCE. The fragments do not always agree with one another. Some versions omit the antediluvian section entirely. Others include different kings or different reign lengths. The variation itself tells us something important. This was not a fixed historical document, but rather a living tradition, modified by successive scribes for their own political and theological purposes. The 8 kings named in the antediluvian section ruled from 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibia, Larak, Sipar, and Shuruppak. In Eridu, Alalim became king and reigned for 28,800 years. His successor Alalgar reigned for 36,000 years. The pattern continues through the other cities, with reign lengths that are clearly not meant to be taken as literal years in any modern sense. Scholars have long noted that these numbers are not arbitrary. They are based on the Sumerian sexagesimal system, calculated in units of sars, each sar representing 3,600 years, and nears, each near representing 600 years. The mathematical precision suggests an underlying system of calculation, though what that system encoded remains debated. Thorkild Jacobsen, the Danish scholar who produced the definitive critical edition of the King List in 1939, proposed that the antediluvian section was added to an earlier version of the list during the Asin dynasty period, around 2000 BCE. The addition served a propaganda purpose. By connecting the rulers of Isin to an unbroken chain of kingship extending back to the very first city, the scribes could legitimize their own dynasty's claim to power. Political propaganda, however, does not preclude the preservation of genuine tradition. The names of the antediluvian kings appear in other Sumerian texts, suggesting they were not invented wholesale for the king list but drawn from an existing body of mythological or legendary material. The 7th king on the list, Enmeduranki of Sippar, presents a particularly intriguing parallel with biblical tradition. According to later Mesopotamian sources, Enmeduranki was taken up to heaven and initiated into the secrets of divination by the gods Shamash and Adad. He was the founder of the Baru, the guild of diviners who read omens in the entrails of sacrificed animals and the patterns of smoke and oil on water. The biblical patriarch Enoch, 7th in the line from Adam, similarly walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him away. The parallel is too precise to be coincidental. It suggests that both the Sumerian and Hebrew traditions drew upon a common pool of Near Eastern legendary material, perhaps originating in the 3rd millennium BCE or earlier. The flood that separates the antediluvian from the post-diluvian sections of the king list appears in multiple Mesopotamian sources with remarkable consistency. The most detailed account comes from the Sumerian flood myth, preserved on a fragmentary tablet from Nippur dating to approximately 1600 BCE. In this text, the flood hero is called Ziusudra, king of Shuruppak, the same city listed as the seat of the last antediluvian king in the Sumerian king list. Ziusudra is warned by the god Enki that the divine assembly has decided to destroy mankind with a flood. He builds a boat, survives the deluge, and afterward receives immortality from the gods. This same story appears in the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, where the flood hero is named Atrahasis, and in the famous Gilgamesh epic, where he is called Utnapishtim. By the time the Hebrew scribes composed the account of Noah, they were drawing on a narrative tradition already at least 1,000 years old. The archaeological evidence for flooding in ancient Mesopotamia is extensive, but it does not support the existence of a single, civilization-destroying deluge. Sir Leonard Woolley, excavating at Ur between 1922 and 1934, discovered a layer of sterile clay approximately 2.5 metres thick, separating earlier occupation levels from the developed Sumerian city above. His initial interpretation, published in his popular book Ur of the Chaldees, was dramatic. He believed he had found physical evidence of the biblical flood. The deposit, he calculated, would have required floodwaters covering the entire region to a depth sufficient to drown even the highest settlements. Woolley's interpretation captured the public imagination but did not survive scholarly scrutiny. Reanalysis of his stratigraphic sections, combined with examination of pottery sequences above and below the clay layer, reveals not a single catastrophic flood deposit but multiple layers of water-lain sediment interspersed with occupation debris, spanning approximately 300 years of intermittent flooding between 2900 and 2600 BCE. The clay did not represent a universal deluge, but rather the kind of severe flooding that periodically devastated riverine settlements in southern Mesopotamia. Catastrophic for those who experienced it, certainly, but local rather than global in extent. Similar flood deposits have been identified at other Mesopotamian sites, but they do not correlate chronologically. At Kish, evidence of flooding dates to approximately 3000 to 2600 BCE, with at least 3 separate flood events at different periods. At Shurapak, the legendary home of Ziu Sudra, a flood deposit dates to approximately 2900 BCE. At Eridu, there is no evidence of a comparable flood deposit at all. If a single catastrophic flood had swept over the entire region simultaneously, we would expect to find a consistent stratigraphic marker across all sites. Instead, we find evidence of multiple localized floods occurring at different times in different places. The significance of Shurapak's flood deposit lies not in its physical extent but in its cultural context. This was the city that Sumerian tradition identified as the home of the flood hero. The archaeological evidence suggests that a particularly severe flood did devastate the settlement around 2900 BCE, an event that may have entered oral tradition and eventually become incorporated into the mythological framework of divine judgment and human survival. The transformation of a local disaster into a universal deluge is not difficult to understand. For the survivors, the world as they knew it had been destroyed, and the story they told their descendants would naturally expand in scope and significance over generations of retelling. The question of flood origins has attracted more speculative attention in recent decades through the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. Proposed in 1997 by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Their hypothesis holds that approximately 7,600 years ago, around 5,600 BCE, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake significantly smaller than its present extent, with its surface approximately 100 to 120 metres below current sea level. As Mediterranean waters rose at the end of the last ice age, they eventually breached the natural dam at the Bosporus Strait, flooding into the Black Sea basin with tremendous force. Ryan and Pittman calculated that water poured through at approximately 200 times the flow rate of Niagara Falls, and that the flooding continued for roughly 300 days. The hypothesis gained widespread public attention, particularly after the publication of Ryan and Pittman's book Noah's Flood: The New Scientific Discoveries about the Event That Changed History in 1998. Underwater explorer Robert Ballard, famous for discovering the wreck of the Titanic, led expeditions that identified what appeared to be ancient shorelines, drowned river valleys, and possible human-made structures at depths of approximately 100 metres off the Black Sea coast of Turkey. The media coverage was extensive, and the idea that a prehistoric flood had inspired the biblical narrative captured popular imagination. The scientific reception, however, has been considerably more sceptical. A 2009 study by Liviu Giosan of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, examining sediment records from the Danube River Delta, suggested that if flooding occurred, it was far more modest than Ryan and Pittman proposed, perhaps 5 to 10 metres of water level rise rather than the catastrophic 100-metre inundation. A 2012 study using analysis of dinoflagellate cyst distribution showed no evidence for catastrophic flooding. Multiple researchers have proposed that water may have flowed in the opposite direction, from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, as the lake overflowed rather than being filled from outside. A comprehensive literature review published in 2022 concluded that there is insufficient evidence for a catastrophic flood scenario. The review noted the absence of archaeological evidence one would expect from a major disaster. No sudden abandonment layers, no mass burial sites, no material culture discontinuities that would indicate populations fleeing or dying in large numbers. The human inhabitants of the Black Sea region, if they existed during this period, either adapted to gradual environmental change or did not experience the kind of catastrophic disruption that would have generated flood myths. Yet even if the Black Sea deluge hypothesis cannot be confirmed, it points toward a genuine phenomenon that may have contributed to flood traditions worldwide, the dramatic environmental changes at the end of the last ice age. Global sea levels rose approximately 120 metres between the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, and the present day. Vast coastal plains were submerged. The Bering Land Bridge, which had connected Asia to North America, disappeared beneath the waves. The Persian Gulf, which had been dry land during the glacial period, gradually filled with water. For coastal populations everywhere, the world was literally shrinking and the waters were literally rising. These changes occurred over millennia rather than days, but they were real, they were experienced, and they may well have contributed to the near-universal human memory of a time when the waters covered the Earth. The Younger Dryas event, occurring approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, represents the most dramatic climate shift in recent human history, and has attracted considerable attention from researchers seeking to explain both flood myths and the mass extinctions of Ice Age megafauna. During the preceding Bolling-Allerød interstadial, temperatures had been warming and ice sheets retreating. Then suddenly, temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped by 3 to 10 degrees Celsius, depending on location, and glacial conditions returned for approximately 1,000 to 200 years. In Greenland, ice core data suggests the cooling occurred over just a few decades or even less. The leading scientific explanation for the Younger Dryas involves disruption of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the system of ocean currents that transports heat from the tropics to northern latitudes. The hypothesis, first proposed by Klaus Ruth in 1982 and elaborated by Wallace Breaker and George Denton, suggests that massive outflows of fresh water from melting North American ice sheets, possibly including catastrophic releases from glacial lakes like Lake Agassiz, flooded into the North Atlantic, freshening the surface waters and disrupting the thermohelian circulation. The resulting climate shift would have affected weather patterns across the Northern Hemisphere and beyond. More controversial is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, proposed in 2007 by Richard Firestone and colleagues. This hypothesis holds that a comet or asteroid fragmented over North America, causing widespread wildfires, destabilizing ice sheets, and contributing to the extinction of Pleistocene megafauna such as mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths. Proponents point to the presence of what they interpret as impact markers, nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, and elevated platinum concentrations in sediment layers dating to the Younger Dryas boundary across North America and at scattered locations worldwide. The hypothesis remains highly contested within the scientific community. A comprehensive review published in 2023 concluded that there is no support for the basic premise that human populations were diminished or that megafaunal extinctions were caused by a cosmic catastrophe. Critics argue that the proposed impact markers can be explained by terrestrial processes such as volcanism and biomass burning, that the megafaunal extinction pattern does not match what would be expected from a sudden catastrophic event, and that the timing of extinctions varies significantly across different regions and species. The Australian megafauna, for instance, went extinct approximately 30,000 years before the hypothetical impact, while woolly mammoths survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic until approximately 2000 BCE, more than 10,000 years after the proposed event. What is not in dispute is that the Younger Dryas period involved significant environmental stress, substantial glacier melt, and flooding events of varying severity in different regions. Lake Agassiz, the massive glacial meltwater lake that covered much of central North America during and after the last ice age, experienced multiple outburst events as ice dams failed and released enormous volumes of water. These floods would have been catastrophic for any populations in their path. Whether such events contributed to cultural memories of a great flood remains speculative, but the mechanism is plausible. The period between the end of the Younger Dryas, approximately 11,700 years ago, and the emergence of Sumerian cities in the 4th millennium BCE represents one of the most profound transformations in human history. It is during this period that the Neolithic Revolution unfolded, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and settled life that would eventually make urban civilization possible. The question posed by the title of this documentary, what happened in the 6,000 years after the Great Flood, before Sumerian cities appeared, finds its answer not in any single event, but in the gradual accumulation of knowledge, technique, and social organization that occurred during this long span of human development. The Neolithic Revolution did not happen in a single place or a single moment. It emerged through a process of experimentation, adaptation, and cultural transmission across multiple generations. The earliest evidence for plant domestication comes from the Fertile Crescent, the arc of relatively well-watered land stretching from the Jordan Valley through southern Turkey and down into Mesopotamia. Wild wheat and barley grew naturally in this region, and hunter-gatherers had been exploiting these grains for thousands of years before anyone began deliberately cultivating them. At the site of Ohallo II, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, in northern Israel. Apoe. Use where analysis of flint blades dated to approximately 23,000 years ago provides evidence for systematic cereal harvesting. These hunter-gatherers were not yet farmers, but they had already developed the tools and techniques for exploiting wild grain patches. The transition to actual cultivation, planting saved seeds, weeding competing plants, irrigation, took several more thousand years to develop and spread. The Natufian culture, which flourished in the Levant between approximately 14,500 and 11,500 years ago, represents a crucial intermediate stage. The Natufians built permanent settlements, some containing hundreds of residents, and relied heavily on wild cereals for their subsistence. At sites like Ein Malaheh in Israel and Abu Huraira in Syria, archaeologists have found extensive evidence of grain processing, including grinding stones, storage facilities, and carbonized seeds. The Natufians were not yet farmers in the full sense. Their cereals were still morphologically wild, but they had taken the first steps towards settled, agriculturally dependent life. The climatic disruption of the Younger Dryas may have accelerated the transition to full agriculture. Abu Huraira provides particularly compelling evidence for this hypothesis. During the warming period before the Younger Dryas, the site's inhabitants relied on a diverse range of wild plants and animals. When temperatures dropped and the climate became more arid, many of their traditional food sources became scarce or disappeared. Rather than abandoning the settlement, the population adapted by cultivating rye, one of the earliest instances of deliberate crop cultivation yet documented. The rye grains recovered from Younger Dryas levels at Abu Huraira are larger than their wild counterparts, a sign of selection for desirable traits and incipient domestication. By approximately 9000 BCE, the Neolithic package of domesticated crops and animals had crystallized in the Fertile Crescent. Emmer wheat, einkorn wheat and barley formed the cereal foundation. Lentils, peas, chickpeas and flax provided supplementary nutrition and fibre. Sheep and goats, domesticated from their wild ancestors in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, provided meat, milk, wool and hides. Cattle and pigs would follow somewhat later. This suite of domesticates spread rapidly across the Near East and eventually to Europe, Africa and beyond, transforming human societies wherever it travelled. The site that most dramatically challenges conventional assumptions about the relationship between agriculture, settlement and monumental architecture is Göbekli Tepe, located in southeastern Turkey near the modern city of Şanlıurfa. The site was first noted in a 1963 archaeological survey, but was largely dismissed until German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt recognized its significance in 1994 and began systematic excavations the following year. What Schmidt uncovered would fundamentally reshape our understanding of what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of achieving. Göbekli Tepe consists of multiple circular enclosures built into the bedrock of a limestone ridge. At the centre of each enclosure stand massive T-shaped pillars, carved from single blocks of limestone weighing up to 15 tons. The largest pillars reach heights of 5.5 metres. Many are decorated with elaborate relief carvings depicting wild animals. Lions, bulls, foxes, snakes, spiders, scorpions, vultures and various other creatures. Some pillars feature human arms carved in low relief, suggesting that the T-shape represents a stylized human figure. The floors are made of carefully prepared terrazzo, burnt lime, indicating sophisticated construction techniques. Radiocarbon dating places the construction of the earliest enclosures at approximately 9,600 to 9,000 BCE, making Göbekli Tepe among the oldest known monumental structures in the world. It predates Stonehenge by approximately 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by approximately 7,000 years. Most significantly, it predates agriculture. The site contains no evidence of domesticated plants or animals. The stone tools are consistent with those used by hunter-gatherers. The animal bones found at the site are exclusively from wild species, gazelles, auroch, wild boar, red deer. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not Yasuja farmers. They were hunter-gatherers who somehow mobilized the labor and resources necessary to quarry, transport, carve, and erect stones of monumental scale. The excavations, which continued under Schmidt's direction until his death in 2014, and subsequently under the joint direction of Istanbul University, Şanlıurfa Museum, and the German Archaeological Institute, have revealed that the site is far more extensive than initially recognized. Geophysical surveys indicate at least 20 large enclosures buried within the mound, of which less than 10% has been excavated as of the most recent reports. Each enclosure appears to have been built, used for a period of time, and then deliberately buried, the spaces filled with debris and soil before new enclosures were constructed nearby. The site was in use for approximately 1,500 years before being finally abandoned around 8,000 BCE. Recent excavations have complicated the initial interpretation of Göbekli Tepe as a purely ceremonial site visited periodically by dispersed hunter-gatherer groups. Evidence of domestic activity, living quarters, food processing equipment, animal and plant remains indicating extended residence, suggests that the site may have been more permanently occupied than previously thought. Dr. Mehmet Önal of Harran University has suggested that at least 15 more stone enclosures remain to be excavated, including one that may date as far back as 13,000 BCE. If confirmed, this would push the timeline of monumental construction back even further. The implications of Göbekli Tepe for understanding the Neolithic Revolution are profound. The conventional model held that agriculture came first, producing the food surpluses necessary to support specialized craftsmen, religious specialists, and the labor forces required for monumental construction. Göbekli Tepe inverts this sequence. Here, monumental construction preceded agriculture. Some archaeologists now argue that the desire to build and maintain such sacred sites may have actually spurred the development of agriculture, that religion drove economics rather than the other way around. The need to feed the labor forces gathering at Göbekli Tepe may have provided the incentive for nearby communities to experiment with cultivation and eventually domesticate the wild grains that grew in the surrounding hills. Approximately 350 kilometers south of Göbekli Tepe, in the Konya Plain of south-central Turkey, lies another site that provides crucial evidence for understanding Neolithic society, Çatalhöyük. This massive settlement was occupied from approximately 7,500 to 5,600 BCE, beginning roughly when Göbekli Tepe was being deliberately buried and abandoned. Where Göbekli Tepe was characterized by monumental enclosures and T-shaped pillars, Çatalhöyük consisted of densely packed mud brick houses with no streets between them. Residents entered their homes through holes in the roofs, walking across the rooftops of their neighbors' houses to reach their own. Excavations at Çatalhöyük, conducted by James Mellart in the 1960s and subsequently by Ian Hodder of Stanford University beginning in 1993, have revealed an extraordinary record of Neolithic life. The settlement at its peak may have housed between 3,500 and 8,000 people, though recent studies using more rigorous population modelling techniques suggest the actual number may have been lower, perhaps 600 to 800 residents during an average year in the settlement's middle phase, around 6,700 to 6,500 BCE. Even the lower estimate represents an extraordinary population for a Neolithic community, and the site's 18 successive layers of occupation testify to more than a millennium of continuous habitation. The houses at Çatalhöyük were decorated with elaborate wall paintings and relief sculptures, many depicting wild animals such as bulls, leopards, and vultures. Bullhorns, or bucrania, were mounted on walls and platforms. The dead were buried beneath the floors of houses, their bodies often defleshed and their skulls sometimes removed, plastered and painted before being reburied or circulated among the living. The uniformity of house sizes and burial practices has led archaeologists to characterize Çatalhöyük as a remarkably egalitarian society, with little evidence of wealth differentiation or social hierarchy. The subsistence economy of Çatalhöyük combined agriculture with hunting and gathering. The residents cultivated wheat and barley and kept domestic cattle, but they also hunted wild animals and gathered wild plants. Bioarchaeological analysis of the human remains from the site, conducted by Clark Spencer Larson of Ohio State University and colleagues, reveals a population that experienced the characteristic stresses of early agricultural life. Dental problems from grain-heavy diets, evidence of infectious disease facilitated by crowded living conditions, and bone changes indicating heavy physical labour. Life expectancy was short by modern standards, and infant mortality was high. Çatalhöyük demonstrates that the transition to settled agricultural life was neither sudden nor complete. For centuries, communities balanced cultivation with foraging, domestic animals with wild game. The settlement shows no evidence of central planning or coordinated public works. Each house was built independently, its walls shared with neighbouring structures in an organic, unplanned fashion. The elaborate symbolic life evidenced by the wall paintings and burial practices suggests a rich religious imagination. But there are no temples, no obvious priests or rulers, no palaces or administrative buildings. Whatever social organisation existed at Çatalhöyük, it operated without the formal hierarchies that would characterise later urban civilizations. While communities like Çatalhöyük were flourishing in Anatolia, a parallel development was occurring in southern Mesopotamia that would lead directly to the emergence of Sumerian civilization. The Ubaid culture, named after the site of Tel al-Ubaid, discovered by British archaeologists in the 1920s, represents the immediate predecessor of the urban societies that would transform human history. The Ubaid period extended from approximately 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, a span of nearly 3 millennia during which the foundations of Mesopotamian civilization were laid. The earliest Ubaid site discovered to date is Tel el-Awali, located approximately 3.5 kilometers southeast of the ancient city of Larsa in southern Iraq. Excavations conducted by French archaeologist Jean-Louis Yeux between 1976 and 1989, and resumed in 2019, have revealed occupation layers predating those of Eridu, the city that Sumerian tradition identified as the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven. The discovery of Tel el-Awali pushed back the date of human occupation in Lower Mesopotamia to approximately 6,500 BCE, demonstrating that the region had been settled far earlier than previously recognized. The environment of southern Mesopotamia during the Ubaid period was challenging, but not impossible for human habitation. Summer temperatures could exceed 50 degrees Celsius, and annual rainfall was insufficient for rain-fed agriculture. Survival required irrigation, the diversion of water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to agricultural fields through a network of canals and ditches. The Ubaid communities developed the techniques of canal-based irrigation that would remain fundamental to Mesopotamian agriculture for the next 5,000 years. They also exploited the rich wetland environments of the river deltas, fishing and hunting waterfowl and harvesting reeds for building material. Ubaid pottery is distinctive and easily recognized. Buff or greenish clay decorated with geometric designs in brown or black paint. This pottery spread across an enormous geographic area, from central Turkey to the Persian Gulf, indicating extensive trade networks and cultural connections. The pottery was likely not traded directly over such vast distances, but rather transmitted through a chain of local exchanges, with each community copying and adapting the styles they encountered from their neighbours. The result was a remarkable cultural homogeneity across the Ubaid world. Not a single unified empire, but a shared set of traditions, technologies, and probably religious beliefs. It was during the Ubaid period that the first temples appeared in Mesopotamia. At Eridu, excavations by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 revealed 18 superimposed mud brick temples, the earliest dating to approximately 5,400 BCE. The sequence demonstrates a continuous process of reconstruction and elaboration. Each new temple was built upon the ruins of its predecessor, growing larger and more complex over time. The earliest structure was a small room approximately 12 by 15 feet, containing a simple altar and a niche for a cult statue. By the end of the sequence, the temples had become massive architectural complexes with elaborate facades, multiple rooms, and towering platforms that anticipated the ziggurats of later periods. The temples at Eridu were dedicated to Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom, who according to Sumerian mythology had founded the city and established the first laws of civilization. Fish bones and ash found around the altars suggest that the god's worshippers offered him freshwater fish, an appropriate sacrifice for a deity associated with the life-giving waters of the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean from which all springs and rivers were believed to flow. The continuity of worship at this single location over more than 2 millennia demonstrates the remarkable stability of Mesopotamian religious tradition and the deep roots from which Sumerian civilization would eventually grow. The transition from Ubaid to Uruk culture, beginning around 4000 BCE, marks the emergence of true urban civilization in Mesopotamia. The city of Uruk, located approximately 100 kilometers northwest of Eridu along the Euphrates, grew during this period to become the largest urban center in the world. By 3100 BCE, the city proper covered approximately 250 hectares, nearly 1 square mile, and supported a population that some scholars estimate at 40,000 to 80,000 people. The surrounding region, including satellite settlements and agricultural lands, may have supported an additional population of similar size. Nothing comparable existed anywhere else on Earth at that time. The growth of Uruk was accompanied by a series of innovations that would define civilization for millennia to come. The potter's wheel, invented during this period, enabled mass production of standardized vessels for storage, transport, and everyday use. Cylinder seals, small stone cylinders carved with intricate designs that could be rolled across wet clay to produce a distinctive impression, provided a means of marking ownership and authenticating documents, an early form of signature or trademark. Most significantly, it was at Uruk that writing emerged. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets, dating to approximately 3350 to 3200 BCE, were discovered during German excavations at Uruk beginning in the late 1920s. Approximately 5,000 such tablets are now known, the vast majority from Uruk itself. These earliest written documents were not literature, not history, not religious texts. They were accounting records, lists of commodities, quantities of grain, numbers of animals, disbursements of rations. Writing emerged not from a desire to record stories or communicate across distances, but from the administrative needs of complex institutions, most likely temples, that required systematic methods for tracking the production, storage, and distribution of goods. The script itself evolved from an earlier system of clay tokens and bullae that had been in use across the Near East since at least the 9th millennium BCE. Small clay objects of various shapes, cones, spheres, discs, tetrahedra, were used to represent specific quantities of specific goods. A cone might represent a small measure of grain, a sphere might represent a larger measure. These tokens were sometimes enclosed in clay envelopes called bullae, which were then sealed with cylinder seal impressions. To know what was inside a bulla without breaking it, scribes began impressing the tokens on the outside surface before sealing them inside. Eventually the impression alone became sufficient, and the tokens themselves were no longer needed. The impressed marks evolved into incised signs, and writing was born. Recent research published in 2024 by Silvia Ferrara and colleagues at the University of Bologna has demonstrated direct links between the motifs carved on Uruk period cylinder seals, dating back to approximately 4400 BCE, and the pictographic signs of the proto-cuneiform script. Scenes depicting the transport and storage of jars, textile production, and temple rituals on cylinder seals were transformed into written signs representing these same concepts. The invention of writing was not a sudden inspiration but a gradual evolution, building on centuries of visual communication and administrative practice. The proto-cuneiform script contained approximately 700 different signs, many of them still undeciphered. The script was not phonetic, it represented words and concepts rather than sounds, and it could theoretically be read in any language. Only gradually over the following centuries did scribes begin to use signs phonetically, enabling the recording of grammar, syntax, and eventually the sounds of the Sumerian language itself. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, cuneiform had become a fully expressive writing system capable of recording literature, law, diplomacy, and every other form of human communication. The archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia demonstrates continuous cultural development from the earliest Ubaid settlements through the emergence of Sumerian cities. There is no gap, no interruption, no break in the sequence that would correspond to a civilization-destroying flood. The same is true of the broader Near Eastern record. At Göbekli Tepe, construction began around 9600 BCE and continued until approximately 8000 BCCE. At Çatalhöyük, occupation extended from 7500 to 5600 BCCE without interruption. At Eridu, temples were built, used, demolished, and rebuilt in continuous succession from 5400 BCE onward. At Uruk, urban growth accelerated through the 4th millennium until the city became the world's first true metropolis. This continuity poses a fundamental problem for attempts to reconcile the archaeological record with biblical or Mesopotamian flood chronology. Young Earth creationists, working backward from the documented reign of Solomon and using the genealogies of Genesis to calculate elapsed time, arrive at a date for Noah's flood around 2304 BCE, but by 2304 BCE, Sumerian civilization was already ancient history. The city of Ur had been a major urban centre for 1,000 years. Writing had been in continuous use for more than a millennium. The pyramids of Egypt had been standing for 3 centuries. Whatever flood may have occurred, and local floods certainly did occur, it cannot have destroyed civilization, because civilization was already thriving before, during, and after any proposed flood date. Alternative chronologies that place the flood earlier, around 5000 BCE or even 7500 BCE based on the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis or the Younger Dryas events, face the opposite problem. These dates precede, rather than follow, the emergence of Sumerian cities. If the Great Flood occurred around 5600 BCE, as Ryan and Pittman proposed, then Çatalhöyük was still occupied, Eridu was being founded, and the developments that would lead to urban civilization were just beginning. There would be no 6,000 years after the flood to explain. The flood would have occurred during or before the period of development, not after it. The Sumerian king list itself provides no solution to this chronological puzzle. The impossibly long reigns assigned to the antediluvian kings, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years, cannot be correlated with any physical chronology. Attempts to interpret these numbers as encoded astronomical cycles, as multiples of base 60 mathematical units, or as later scribal misunderstandings of an original shorter chronology have produced varying results. What seems clear is that the Sumerians themselves did not intend the antediluvian section of the king list as a literal historical record in the modern sense. It served theological and political purposes, establishing the divine origin of kingship, connecting contemporary rulers to the earliest days of civilization, affirming that despite the catastrophe of the flood, the institutions of human society had been restored and would endure. The parallel between the Sumerian king list and the genealogies of Genesis has long fascinated scholars. Both texts list 8 principal figures between the first man and the flood hero. The Sumerian list excludes both the primordial first man and the flood survivors Yusudra, while Genesis counts Adam through Noah. Both describe extraordinarily long lifespans before the flood, with dramatic decreases afterward. Both treat the flood as a decisive break in human history, separating an earlier age of legendary figures from a later age of more recognizable kings and patriarchs. The 7th figure in each list occupies a special position. A Medioranki of Sippar, according to Mesopotamian tradition, was taken up to heaven and initiated into divine secrets. Enoch, 7th from Adam, walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him away. The correspondence is too precise to be coincidental, and suggests direct literary or oral transmission between Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions. The flood narrative itself shows obvious parallels: a divine decision to destroy humanity, a warning to a righteous man, the construction of a boat, the survival of the hero and his family, the sending out of birds to test whether the waters have receded, the sacrifice offered after the flood, the divine promise not to destroy humanity again. The direction of influence has been debated, but most scholars agree that the Mesopotamian flood tradition is older than the Hebrew version and likely served as its source, whether directly or through intermediate traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered in the mid-19th century in the ruins of Nineveh, provided the first clear evidence of this relationship. Tablet 11 of the epic contains the flood narrative told by Utnapishtim to Gilgamesh, and its parallels to Genesis are unmistakable. The Atrahasis epic, known from copies dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BCE, provides an even earlier version of the story, complete with the Divine Council's decision to destroy humanity, the god Enki's warning to the flood hero, and the construction of the boat according to divine specifications. These parallels do not prove that a great flood actually occurred. They prove that a flood tradition existed in the ancient Near East, that it was widely known and transmitted across cultures, and that it served important theological functions in multiple religious systems. The flood marked the end of an age when gods and humans interacted more directly, when lifespans were longer and the world was different. It served as a reminder of divine power and human vulnerability, a warning against the hubris that might provoke divine wrath, and a promise that despite past catastrophes, the world would continue and human civilization would endure. The 6,000 years between the end of the last ice age and the emergence of Sumerian cities were not years of waiting for civilization to begin after some catastrophic interruption. They were years of active development, experimentation, and cultural evolution. Hunter-gatherers at Göbekli Tepe organised labour forces capable of quarrying and erecting multi-ton stone pillars. Communities at Çatalhöyük developed complex symbolic systems and elaborate mortuary practices, while maintaining egalitarian social structures for over a millennium. Ubaid farmers along the rivers of southern Mesopotamia invented irrigation agriculture and built the first temples. Urban populations at Uruk created writing, standardized production, and established the institutions that would define complex societies for millennia to come. This process was not linear or inevitable. Communities rose and fell, settlements were abandoned and refounded. Climate fluctuations, resource depletion, disease and conflict all played their roles. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture brought new challenges as well as new opportunities, increased vulnerability to crop failure, new diseases transmitted from domestic animals, the physical toll of agricultural labour. The archaeological record reveals both the achievements and the costs of this transformation. The flood myths of Mesopotamia and the Near East emerge from this context not as memories of a specific historical event, but as cultural constructions that helped make sense of a world in transition. The floods were real. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded regularly, sometimes catastrophically, but their transformation into universal deluges that destroyed all humanity except for a chosen few reflected deeper concerns about divine justice, human survival, and the continuity of civilization. The antediluvian age of impossibly long-lived kings represented not a literal past, but an idealized past, a time before the current order when the world was different and the boundaries between gods and humans were less firmly drawn. The Sumerian king list, the Genesis genealogies, and the flood myths they contain are not historical documents in the modern sense. They are theological documents, political documents, cultural documents that served the needs of the societies that created and transmitted them. The 8 kings who ruled before the flood, the 8 patriarchs from Adam to Noah, represent not actual individuals but categories of mythical ancestor, markers of a sacred past that legitimized the present order. The flood itself, in both traditions, served as a narrative device that explained why the world changed, why the rules were different now, why the kings who came after ruled for decades rather than millennia. The archaeological evidence from the Near East tells a different story than the flood myths. Not a story of catastrophic rupture, but of gradual transformation. The story begins in the warming climate of the early Holocene, as hunter-gatherers in the Fertile Crescent began experimenting with the cultivation of wild grains. It continues through the Neolithic settlements of Anatolia and the Levant, where permanent villages grew to sizes previously unknown. It reaches its culmination in the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia, where irrigation agriculture supported population densities that made urbanization possible, and where the complexities of temple administration drove the invention of writing. Throughout this long process, there is no evidence of a catastrophic flood that destroyed civilization and required it to begin again from scratch. There are local floods, certainly. The Mesopotamian floodplain was subject to periodic inundations that could devastate individual settlements. There are regional environmental changes, the filling of the Persian Gulf, the fluctuating levels of the Black Sea, the climate oscillations of the Younger Dryas, but there is no global deluge, no universal catastrophe, no break in the continuity of human cultural development. The question posed at the beginning of this documentary, what happened in the 6,000 years after the Great Flood, before Sumerian cities appeared, contains an assumption that cannot be sustained by the evidence. The Sumerian cities did not appear after a Great Flood. They developed gradually from Ubaid villages, which developed from earlier Neolithic settlements, which developed from epipaleolithic camps in an unbroken sequence stretching back to the end of the last ice age. The flood myths of Mesopotamia and the Near East are powerful cultural documents that have shaped human imagination for millennia, but they are not historical records of actual events. The real story of those 6,000 years is more complex and, in many ways, more remarkable than any flood narrative. It is the story of how scattered bands of hunter-gatherers transformed themselves into urban civilizations. It is the story of how humans learned to manipulate their environment through agriculture and irrigation, to organize their societies through institutions and hierarchies, to record their thoughts and transactions through writing. It is the story of how the foundations were laid for everything that would follow. Empires and armies, temples and palaces, literature and law, science and philosophy, all the achievements and failures of complex human societies down to the present day. The Weld-Blundell prism remains in its case at the Ashmolean, recording the names of kings who never existed and reigns that never happened, preserving a memory of the past that is more myth than history. But beneath the myth lies a kernel of truth. The Sumerians knew that their civilization had not always existed, that there was a time before cities and temples and writing, that their world had emerged from an earlier world that was different. They explained this emergence through stories of divine intervention and cosmic catastrophe, because they had no other framework for understanding gradual, long-term change. We, standing at a greater temporal distance and armed with the tools of modern archaeology, can tell a different story, not less remarkable for being true, not less profound for being gradual, not less meaningful for lacking the drama of a universal flood. The silent millennia speak to us through stone tools and pottery sherds, through the bones of animals and humans, through the foundations of temples and the impressions of cylinder seals. They tell us of communities adapting to changing environments, of technologies spreading through networks of trade and exchange, of religious ideas taking form in monumental architecture, of social complexity emerging from egalitarian beginnings. They tell us, ultimately, of ourselves, of how we became what we are, of the long road from hunting and gathering to the world we inhabit today. The flood may be myth, but the transformation was real, and its echoes still shape our lives. The temples continue to be excavated. At Eridu, a joint Italian, French and Iraqi team resumed archaeological work in 2019, hoping to uncover additional evidence of the earliest phases of occupation. At Göbekli Tepe, excavations continue under the joint direction of Turkish and German archaeologists, with less than 10% of the site explored and at least 15 more enclosures believed to exist beneath the surface. At Uruk, the site that gave its name to the period of earliest urbanization, archaeological work continues to refine our understanding of the city's development and its role in the emergence of writing. Each new excavation, each new analysis, each new radiocarbon date adds to our understanding of those crucial millennia between the end of the Ice Age and the emergence of civilization. The picture that emerges is not simple, not uniform, not easily summarized. Different regions developed at different rates, followed different trajectories, produced different cultural forms. The Neolithic of Anatolia was not the same as the Neolithic of Mesopotamia, and neither was quite like the Neolithic of the Levant or the Zagros or the Nile Valley. Yet all were connected, directly or indirectly, through networks of trade, migration, and cultural exchange that allowed innovations to spread and traditions to intermingle. The flood myths, too, were part of this exchange. Stories travelled with traders and migrants, were adapted to local contexts, acquired new details and emphases as they moved from one cultural setting to another. The flood hero who was Yusudra in Sumerian became Atrahasis in Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic, and eventually Noah in Hebrew tradition. The divine assembly that decreed the flood became a single righteous God who repented of having made humanity. The story changed, but its core remained. The world was once destroyed by water, a chosen few survived, and civilization began again. Whether some historical event lies at the root of these traditions, a catastrophic local flood at Shurapak, a slow inundation of the Black Sea Basin, the dramatic climate shifts of the Younger Dryas, remains uncertain and may never be definitively resolved. What is certain is that the flood myths served important functions for the societies that preserved them, explaining the past, legitimizing the present, and warning of the future. They are not history in the modern sense, but they are windows into how ancient peoples understood their world and their place in it. The 6,000 years between the end of the Ice Age and the emergence of Sumerian cities were years of transformation, not years of recovery from catastrophe. They were years in which human beings learned to reshape their environment, their societies and themselves. The story of those years is still being written, layer by archaeological layer, tablet by cuneiform tablet, site by excavated site. It is a story without the drama of a universal flood, but with a grandeur of its own, the grandeur of human ingenuity, persistence and creativity working across countless generations to build the foundations of the world we inherit. The prism sits in its case, recording kings who ruled before the flood swept over. The archaeologists dig beneath the sands, uncovering temples that predate any proposed flood, settlements that flourished continuously for millennia, a past that was not interrupted but transformed. Both records are part of our heritage, the myths that helped our ancestors make sense of their world, and the evidence that helps us understand what actually happened. Between them lies the truth of those silent centuries waiting still to be fully understood. The development of metallurgy during these millennia represents another thread in the tapestry of early civilization, one that demonstrates the gradual accumulation of technological knowledge rather than any sudden post-Diluvian recovery. Copper working appears in the archaeological record of the Near East as early as the 8th millennium BCE, initially in the form of cold-work native copper, raw metal hammered into simple shapes without the application of heat. The transition to smelting, the extraction of metal from ore through the application of fire, occurred gradually over the following millennia, with clear evidence from sites in Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains by approximately 5000 BCE. The earliest copper artifacts are simple: beads, pins, small tools that could be shaped through hammering alone. But the technology evolved steadily through experimentation and transmission. By the 5th millennium, smiths had learned to alloy copper with arsenic, producing a harder and more durable metal. By the 4th millennium, tin bronze had appeared, though tin sources were limited, and the new alloy remained relatively rare until later periods. The evolution from native copper to cold working to hot working to smelting to alloying represents thousands of years of accumulated knowledge passed from master to apprentice across countless generations. The metallurgical evidence aligns with the broader picture of gradual technological development. There is no moment when metalworking suddenly appears fully formed, as might be expected if civilization had been destroyed and needed to be rebuilt from lost knowledge. Instead, we see halting experimentation, regional variation, the slow diffusion of techniques from one community to another. Some innovations were discovered and lost and rediscovered. Some spread rapidly, while others remained localized for centuries. The pattern is one of organic growth, not sudden recovery. The astronomical knowledge attributed to ancient Mesopotamian civilizations provides another window into the accumulated wisdom of pre-Sumerian societies. The alignment of structures at Göbekli Tepe suggests that its builders paid careful attention to celestial phenomena, possibly tracking the movements of stars or the positions of sunrise and sunset at different times of year. Pillar 43 in enclosure D, sometimes called the Vulture Stone, has been interpreted by some researchers as depicting astronomical events, though this interpretation remains controversial within the scholarly community. What is not controversial is that by the time of the earliest cuneiform tablets, Mesopotamian scribes possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. They tracked the movements of planets, predicted eclipses, and maintained records of celestial observations extending over centuries. This knowledge did not appear suddenly. It was built up through systematic observation and record-keeping across generations, beginning long before the invention of writing and continuing long after. The astronomical texts from Mesopotamia, preserved on tablets from sites across the region, reveal a civilization deeply invested in understanding the heavens. The movements of Venus were tracked with particular care, as were the appearances of the moon and the wandering of the visible planets against the background of fixed stars. These observations had practical applications. The Mesopotamian calendar was lunisolar, requiring regular adjustment to keep the months aligned with the seasons, but they also had religious and divinatory significance. The heavens were read as messages from the gods, signs of coming fortune or disaster. The precision of these later observations reflects knowledge accumulated over millennia. Modern analysis of Mesopotamian astronomical data has revealed that their predictions of planetary positions and eclipse cycles achieved remarkable accuracy, in some cases matching modern calculations within fractions of a degree. Such precision could only have been achieved through long-term systematic observation. comparing predictions with actual events and refining methods accordingly. The astronomical tradition of Mesopotamia is itself evidence of cultural continuity across centuries, a tradition that could not have survived if civilization had been destroyed and rebuilt from scratch. The development of irrigation agriculture in southern Mesopotamia deserves more detailed examination, as it represents one of the most significant technological achievements of the pre-Sumerian period and a necessary precondition for urban civilization. The alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers receive insufficient rainfall for agriculture, less than 250 millimeters annually in the southern regions where Sumerian cities would emerge. Without irrigation, the land could support only sparse populations of pastoralists and fishers. The rivers themselves provided both the problem and the solution. Annual floods, fed by snowmelt in the mountains of eastern Anatolia, deposited fertile silt across the plains but also destroyed crops planted too near the water's edge. The challenge was to capture the flood waters, channel them to agricultural fields at appropriate times, and drain them away before they could cause damage. This required the construction of canals, dams, levees, and drainage ditches, an infrastructure that demanded coordinated labour and collective decision-making. The earliest evidence for canal irrigation comes from the Ubaid period, with clear archaeological traces at sites like Eridu and Tel el-Weli. The canals were modest by later standards, simple channels dug to direct water from natural watercourses to nearby fields, but they represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between humans and their environment. Instead of adapting to the landscape, communities were now reshaping the landscape to suit their needs. The labour required for irrigation infrastructure was substantial. Canals had to be dug, maintained, and periodically dredged of accumulated silt. Fields had to be prepared with proper levelling and boundaries. Water had to be allocated fairly among competing users. These requirements favoured larger, more organised communities capable of mobilising collective labour and resolving disputes over shared resources. The archaeology of the Ubaid period shows a gradual increase in settlement size and a growing differentiation between larger central communities and smaller satellite villages, the beginnings of settlement hierarchy that would culminate in the urban systems of the Uruk period. The transition from simple channel irrigation to the complex canal systems of later Mesopotamia took centuries of accumulated experience. Early irrigators learned which crops tolerated saline conditions and which required better drainage. They discovered that continuous irrigation without adequate drainage led to salt accumulation in the soil, eventually rendering fields unproductive. They developed techniques for flushing fields with excess water to leach salts from the root zone. Each generation built on the knowledge of its predecessors, refining techniques and expanding the cultivated area. By the 4th millennium BCE, irrigation agriculture had transformed the landscape of southern Mesopotamia. What had been sparsely populated marshland and desert fringe became one of the most densely settled regions in the ancient world. The surplus food production made possible by irrigation supported not only larger populations but also specialised craftsmen, religious specialists, and administrators who did not produce their own food. It was this economic foundation that made Sumerian civilization possible. The organisation of labour for large-scale projects provides crucial insight into social development during the pre-Sumerian period. The construction of monumental architecture at Göbekli Tepe required coordinated effort on a scale that challenges conventional assumptions about hunter-gatherer societies. The T-shaped pillars, weighing up to 15 tons each, had to be quarried from limestone bedrock, transported across rough terrain, and erected in precisely planned positions. Modern experimental archaeology suggests that moving stones of this size would have required crews of 500 or more workers operating in coordinated teams with specialised roles. How such labour was organised in a society without permanent settlements, central authority, or surplus food storage remains one of the great puzzles of prehistoric archaeology. The traditional model of social evolution held that labour mobilisation on this scale required agricultural surplus and political hierarchy, chiefs or priests who could command resources and direct workers. Göbekli Tepe inverts this model. Here, monumental construction preceded agriculture and occurred without evidence of marked social hierarchy. One hypothesis holds that the site served as a periodic gathering place for dispersed hunter-gatherer groups, who came together at certain seasons to participate in communal rituals and construction projects. The labour for moving and erecting the great stones would have been provided not by a permanent workforce but by temporary assemblages of people from across a wide region. motivated by religious obligation rather than political coercion. This model finds support in the diversity of tool types and raw materials found at the site, suggesting inputs from multiple source areas. The animal remains from Göbekli Tepe tell a similar story. The bones are overwhelmingly from wild species, gazelles, auroch, wild boar, deer, rather than domesticated animals, but the quantities are enormous, far exceeding what a small permanent population could have accumulated. The evidence suggests large-scale feasting, with hundreds or thousands of animals butchered to feed the labour crews and ritual participants. The site may have functioned as a centre of redistribution, where scattered groups came together to share food, participate in ceremonies, and contribute labour to the ongoing construction projects. This model of labour organisation differs fundamentally from what would emerge in later urban civilizations, where permanent institutions, temples, palaces, households of the elite, commanded labour through religious authority, political power, or economic dependency. But it demonstrates that complex, coordinated labour was possible even without such institutions, given sufficient religious or social motivation. The capacity for large-scale cooperation may have preceded and enabled the development of formal hierarchy rather than following from it. The emergence of social hierarchy during the Ubaid period represents a crucial transition between the relatively egalitarian societies of the earlier Neolithic and the stratified urban civilizations of the Uruk period and beyond. The evidence for this transition is subtle but cumulative. Variations in house size and construction quality, differences in burial goods and mortuary treatment, the increasing elaboration of temple architecture relative to domestic structures. At Tel el-Wali and other early Ubaid sites, houses are relatively uniform in size and construction, and burial goods show little variation, a pattern consistent with the egalitarian social organisation observed at earlier sites like Çatalhöyük. By the later Ubaid period, particularly Ubaid IV, approximately 4500 to 4000 BCE, differences become more pronounced. Some houses are significantly larger and better constructed than others. Some burials contain more elaborate goods, pottery, beads, copper, objects, while others are simple interments with minimal offerings. The temples show the most dramatic changes. The sequence of superimposed temples at Eridu grows not only larger, but more architecturally elaborate over time, with increasingly complex facades, multiple rooms, and raised platforms. By the late Ubaid period, temples had become the dominant structures in their communities, dwarfing domestic architecture and commanding resources on a scale that suggests institutional power rather than purely voluntary participation. The causes of this hierarchical development remain debate. Some scholars emphasize the demands of irrigation management, arguing that the coordination required for canal construction and water allocation naturally concentrated power in the hands of those who controlled access to this critical resource. Others point to the religious functions of temples as centers of redistribution, collecting offerings from the community and dispersing them according to ritual and social obligations. Still others emphasize craft specialization and long-distance trade as drivers of wealth accumulation and social differentiation. Most likely, all these factors played roles in a complex, mutually reinforcing process. Irrigation required coordination, which favored centralized decision-making. Temples provided ideological justification for inequality, framing the concentration of resources as service to the gods rather than exploitation of the community. Trade generated wealth that could be accumulated and displayed, marking some families as different from and superior to their neighbours. Craft specialization created dependencies, as communities came to rely on skilled producers for essential goods they could no longer make themselves. The result, by the end of the Ubaid period, was a society significantly more stratified than anything that had preceded it in Mesopotamia. Not yet a state, not yet truly urban, but clearly moving in that direction. The foundations for Sumerian civilization were being laid, brick by mud brick, generation by generation, in a process that no single catastrophe had interrupted and no single recovery could explain. The role of long-distance trade in pre-Sumerian development provides another dimension of this gradual transformation. Southern Mesopotamia is notably lacking in many essential raw materials: hard stone suitable for tools, metal ores, quality timber for construction. From the earliest periods of settlement, communities in the region were connected to exchange networks that brought these materials from sources hundreds of kilometers distant. Obsidian, the volcanic glass prized for its razor-sharp edges, provides particularly clear evidence of these connections. Chemical analysis can trace obsidian artifacts to their geological sources with considerable precision, revealing patterns of exchange that extended across vast distances. Obsidian from sources in eastern Anatolia around Lake Van appears at Ubaid sites throughout Mesopotamia. Obsidian from the Zagros Mountains of western Iran travelled westward. The networks that moved this material also moved ideas, technologies, and perhaps people. Lapis lazuli, the blue stone prized for jewellery and decorative objects, came from even farther afield, the mountains of Afghanistan, more than 2,000 kilometres from the Mesopotamian heartland. Its presence in Ubaid contexts demonstrates that exchange networks of remarkable extent were already functioning thousands of years before the emergence of Sumerian civilization. These were not casual exchanges between neighbouring communities, but systematic trading relationships spanning multiple cultural zones and ecological regions. Copper and copper ore provide similar evidence. The sources of copper used in Mesopotamia have been traced through chemical analysis to deposits in Anatolia, the Zagros and the Oman Peninsula. The metal or its ore had to travel hundreds of kilometres to reach Mesopotamian settlements, implying organised trading expeditions, established routes, and relationships of exchange maintained over extended periods. These trade networks were not merely economic but also cultural. The spread of Ubaid pottery styles across such a vast area, from central Turkey to the Persian Gulf, suggests that goods travelled along with our ideas, beliefs, and practices. Communities that adopted Ubaid pottery styles may also have adopted elements of Ubaid religious practice, social organisation, or technological knowledge. The uniformity of Ubaid material culture across such diverse environments speaks to a shared cultural orientation that transcended local differences. The archaeological site of H3 and Q8, dated to the Ubaid period, provides evidence that these networks extended to maritime trade as well. The site has yielded the earliest known evidence of seafaring, pottery and other materials that must have been transported by boat across the Persian Gulf. Fishing communities along the Gulf Coast were integrated into the Ubaid exchange system, providing marine resources and potentially serving as intermediaries in trade with more distant regions. The significance of these trade networks for understanding pre-Sumerian development lies in what they reveal about organisational capacity. Long-distance trade requires planning, coordination, and social trust. Traders must be provisioned for journeys lasting weeks or months. Goods must be accumulated for exchange and protected in transit. Relationships must be maintained with partners in distant communities, often across linguistic and cultural boundaries. The existence of such networks in the 5th and 4th millennia BCE demonstrates sophisticated social organisation well before the emergence of states or writing. The transition from the Ubaid period to the Uruk period, around 4000 BCE, marks an acceleration of trends that had been developing for millennia. Population grew rapidly, concentrated increasingly in large settlements. Social hierarchy became more pronounced, with clear evidence of elite households and institutional power. Craft specialisation intensified, producing standardised goods for consumption and exchange. Administrative practices became more complex, eventually requiring new technologies, including writing, to manage the flow of information. The city of Uruk itself exemplifies these developments. What had been a modest settlement during the Ubaid period grew dramatically during the 4th millennium, absorbing population from surrounding areas and becoming the dominant centre of its region. By 3100 BCE, the city proper covered approximately 250 hectares, with a population that may have approached 40,000 people. The surrounding region, controlled politically and economically from Uruk, supported additional tens of thousands. The architecture of Uruk during this period reveals the scale of institutional power. The Eanna precinct, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, contained temple buildings of unprecedented size and elaboration. The White Temple, constructed atop a massive ziggurat platform, dominated the urban landscape and would have been visible for kilometres across the flat alluvial plain. The labour required to construct and maintain such buildings, quarrying and transporting limestone and moulding and firing millions of mud bricks, organising work crews of hundreds or thousands, testifies to the mobilisation capacity of the temple institution. The administrative complexity of Uruk's temples drove the invention of writing. The temple economy received offerings from worshippers, managed agricultural estates, employed workers, maintained workshops, and conducted long-distance trade. Keeping track of these operations required new tools for recording and retrieving information. The clay tablets with proto-cuneiform signs that emerged around 3350 BCE were not literature or history, but accounting documents. Records of grain received and dispersed, animals counted and allocated, workers employed and compensated. The approximately 5,000 proto-cuneiform tablets known from Uruk and to related sites provide a window into the administrative concerns of early Mesopotamian institutions. The texts record quantities of barley, emmer, wheat and other grains. They enumerate animals by species, sex and age. They list workers by category and ration entitlement. They track the production and distribution of textiles, one of Uruk's most important manufactured goods. They are, in short, the records of a complex economic institution managing resources and labour on a scale that required written documentation. The scribes who created these documents were specialists trained in a complex notational system. The proto-cuneiform sign list contained approximately 700 different signs, many of them pictographic in origin but increasingly abstract and stylized over time. Learning to read and write required years of training, creating a small elite with skills essential to institutional function. These scribes would have been among the first truly professional intellectuals in human history, individuals whose primary occupation was the manipulation of symbolic knowledge rather than the production of food or goods. The Uruk expansion of the late 4th millennium BCE carried Mesopotamian culture and influence far beyond its homeland, providing evidence of the dynamism and organizational capacity of early urban civilization. Uruk-style artifacts, architecture, and administrative practices appear at sites across a vast area, from southwestern Iran to southeastern Turkey and beyond. Some sites, like Habuba Kabira on the Euphrates in Syria, appear to have been colonial outposts established by Uruk-based institutions, with populations that included both local inhabitants and immigrants from southern Mesopotamia. The nature and motivation of this expansion remain debated. Some scholars interpret it primarily as commercial, driven by the need to secure access to raw materials unavailable in the alluvial south: timber, metals, precious stones. Others emphasize political or ideological factors, seeing the spread of Uruk culture as a form of cultural imperialism or missionary activity. Still others propose more complex models involving multiple processes: trade, colonization, emulation, and local adaptation all playing roles in different contexts. What is clear is that by the late 4th millennium, Mesopotamian civilization had developed sufficient organizational capacity to project power and influence over enormous distances. The colonies of the Uruk expansion required planning, provisioning, and ongoing communication with the homeland. They maintained distinctive Uruk material culture while adapting to local conditions, suggesting both strong connections to their origins and flexibility in their implementation. The Uruk expansion also provides evidence of interaction between different cultural traditions. At sites in the Syrian Jazira and eastern Anatolia, Uruk materials appear alongside local traditions, suggesting not replacement but coexistence and exchange. The patterns of interaction varied. Some sites show heavy Uruk influence, others only occasional imports or local imitations. The complexity of these patterns defies simple models of conquest or colonization and points instead to a dynamic process of cultural negotiation and adaptation. The collapse of the Uruk expansion around 3100 BCE remains poorly understood. Sites that had shown strong Uruk influence were abandoned or reverted to local traditions. The great trading network that had connected the Mesopotamian heartland to its colonies contracted dramatically. Some scholars have attributed this collapse to climate change, others to political upheaval, still others to the inherent instability of overextended exchange systems. Whatever the cause, the result was a period of retrenchment and local development that would eventually give rise to the city-states of the early dynastic period. The emergence of writing at Uruk represents a culmination of developments that had been unfolding for millennia, not a sudden innovation necessitated by post-flood reconstruction. The proto-cuneiform tablets of the Uruk IV period, approximately 3350 to 3200 BCE, are the earliest true writing known from anywhere in the world, the first documents in which signs represent not just numbers but specific categories of things, and perhaps the sounds of language itself. The transition from the token-based accounting systems of earlier periods to full writing was gradual and can be traced through intermediate stages. Clay bullae containing tokens and marked with seal impressions provided a bridge between three-dimensional record-keeping and two-dimensional notation. Numerical tablets bearing only numerical signs without logographic content show that notation was developing in complexity before the full repertoire of proto-cuneiform signs emerged. The cylinder seal motifs that would eventually contribute to proto-cuneiform sign shapes had been developing for a millennium before writing appeared. This gradual evolution challenges any narrative that would attribute writing to a specific moment of invention or divine revelation. Writing emerged from existing practices of record-keeping, growing incrementally more complex as the administrative demands of large institutions exceeded the capacity of earlier methods. It was not created whole by a single genius or revealed complete by the gods. It was developed through practical experimentation by scribes facing real problems of information management, building on the work of their predecessors and leaving improved methods to their successors. The spread of writing after its invention at Uruk followed a similar pattern of gradual diffusion and adaptation. Proto-cuneiform tablets appear at other Mesopotamian sites, Jemdet Nasser, Kafaja, Tel Uqayr, within a century or two of their first appearance at Uruk, suggesting rapid transmission through trade networks and institutional connections. Proto-Elamite writing, closely related to Proto-Cuneiform but adapted to a different administrative tradition, appeared in southwestern Iran at about the same time. Writing spread not as a fixed system but as a concept and a set of techniques that could be modified to suit local needs and practices. The development of cuneiform proper from its proto-cuneiform origins took additional centuries. The earliest documents are barely readable as language. They represent words and concepts, but provide few clues to pronunciation or grammar. Only gradually did scribes develop techniques for representing the sounds of speech, enabling the recording of its grammatical elements and eventually the composition of true literature. The earliest Sumerian literary texts date to approximately 2600 to 2500 BCE, more than 700 years after the invention of writing. The transition from accounting notation to expressive writing was itself a gradual process, driven by the expanding needs and interests of literate institutions. The archaeological evidence from the Near East presents a coherent picture of human development during the millennia between the end of the Ice Age and the emergence of Sumerian civilization. Hunter-gatherers at Göbekli Tepe demonstrated organizational capacities sufficient for monumental construction. Agricultural communities at Çatalhöyük developed complex symbolic systems and maintained stable populations for more than a millennium. Ubaid villages invented irrigation agriculture and built the first temples. Uruk's urban institutions created writing and projected power across enormous distances. Throughout this long sequence, there is no evidence of catastrophic interruption. No flood deposit separates one period from another in a way that would indicate civilization-wide destruction. No gap in the archaeological record suggests a period when human activity ceased entirely. The development is continuous, cumulative, and gradual, each generation building on the achievements of its predecessors, each innovation making possible further innovations that would follow. This does not mean that the period was without disasters. Local floods certainly occurred, and some, like the flood at Shuruppak around 2900 BCE, were severe enough to devastate settlements and perhaps to enter cultural memory. Climate fluctuations affected agricultural productivity and may have contributed to settlement abandonments and population movements. Conflict between communities left traces in defensive architecture and human remains bearing evidence of violence. Life during these millennia was not easy and survival was not guaranteed, but these disasters, however severe they may have seemed to those who experienced them, did not destroy civilization. They did not require humanity to start over from scratch. They were absorbed into the ongoing process of cultural development, sometimes causing setbacks, but never breaking the continuity of human achievement. The flood myths of Mesopotamia and the Near East preserve memories of disasters, real or imagined, that challenged human communities, but the archaeological record shows that those communities persisted, adapted, and continued to develop. The question with which this documentary began, what happened in the 6,000 years after the Great Flood, before Sumerian cities appeared, turns out to rest on a false premise. The Sumerian cities did not appear after a great flood. They emerged through a gradual process of development that can be traced through the archaeological record in unbroken sequence. The flood myths of Mesopotamia describe not historical events, but cultural constructions that helped ancient peoples make sense of their world, their history, and their relationship with the divine. This does not diminish the significance of those myths. They shaped how millions of people across thousands of years understood their past, their present, and their future. They provided frameworks for thinking about divine justice, human frailty, and the persistence of civilization in the face of catastrophe. They crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries, travelling from Sumerian to Akkadian to Hebrew and beyond, adapting to new contexts while retaining their essential message that the world had been destroyed once and might be destroyed again, that survival was possible for those who found favour with the gods, and that human civilization, however vulnerable, would endure. The archaeological story is different in its details, but similar in its ultimate message. Human civilization did emerge, did develop, did face challenges and overcome them. The process was longer and more gradual than the myths suggest, spanning millennia rather than the lifetime of a single flood hero. But the achievement was no less remarkable for being gradual. From scattered bands of hunter-gatherers to the architects of ziggurats and the inventors of writing, humanity transformed itself and its world through countless small innovations accumulated across countless generations. The temples at Eridu still wait beneath the sands of southern Iraq, their 18 layers recording millennia of continuous worship at a single sacred site. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe still stand, monuments to the organizational capacity of hunter-gatherer societies that preceded agriculture. The tablets of Uruk still yield their secrets to scholars who can read their ancient signs, revealing the administrative concerns of institutions that flourished 5 millennia ago. All these remains speak of continuity, of persistence, of human achievement built upon human achievement across the long millennia between the Ice Age and the emergence of the civilizations we inherit. The Weld Blundell Prism remains in its case at the Ashmolean, recording a past that never was and preserving a truth that transcends historical accuracy. The kings before the flood did not rule for tens of thousands of years. The flood did not destroy all humanity except for a single chosen family. But the prism preserves something real nonetheless, the conviction that the past matters, that the present emerges from the past, that understanding where we came from helps us understand where we are and where we might go. The silent millennia between the Ice Age and Sumer speak to us still, through the objects and structures they left behind, through the descendants of the crops and animals they domesticated, through the writing systems that evolved from their first tentative notations. They speak of human resilience, human creativity, human persistence in the face of challenges that would seem overwhelming to any single generation. They speak of the long road we travelled to become what we are, and of the foundation on which everything since has been built. The story continues to be written. Every excavation season brings new evidence, new questions, new refinements of our understanding. The picture will never be complete. Too much has been lost to decay, destruction, and the simple passage of time. But what remains is enough to tell the story of those crucial millennia, the story of how civilization emerged, not from the receding waters of a universal flood, but from the accumulated efforts of countless generations working, building, learning, and passing on what they had learned to those who came after. The silent centuries have spoken. Their message is one of gradual transformation rather than sudden catastrophe, of continuous development rather than interrupted recovery, of human achievement built piece by piece across the vast expanse of time that separates us from our Ice Age ancestors. It is a story more complex than any myth, more remarkable for being true, and more meaningful for what it reveals about our shared human heritage and the long road that brought us to where we stand today. The pottery traditions of the pre-Sumerian period provide yet another lens through which to observe the gradual accumulation of technological knowledge across these formative millennia. Ceramic technology itself represents one of humanity's earliest transformative inventions, the discovery that fire could permanently change the properties of clay, converting soft, malleable material into hard, durable containers capable of storing liquids and withstanding repeated heating. The earliest pottery in the Near East appears around 7000 BCE, associated with pre-pottery Neolithic cultures that were otherwise technologically sophisticated but had not yet adopted this crucial innovation. The development of pottery techniques proceeded through recognizable stages that archaeological typologies can trace across centuries and geographic regions. Early vessels were formed by hand, built up from coils or slabs of clay smoothed together and fired in open pits at relatively low temperatures. Surface treatments evolved from simple smoothing to elaborate decoration, painted designs, impressed patterns, incised lines that transformed functional objects into expressions of cultural identity. The consistency of decorative motifs across wide areas, as seen in Ubaid pottery, demonstrates cultural communication even in the absence of written language. The invention of the potter's wheel, which occurred during the Uruk period around the mid-4th millennium BCE, revolutionized ceramic production. Wheel-thrown pottery could be produced more rapidly, more uniformly, and in greater quantities than hand-built vessels. The standardization enabled by wheel production facilitated the mass production of storage and transport containers, supporting the larger-scale economic activities that characterized emerging urban civilization. A skilled potter working at a wheel could produce dozens of vessels in a day, compared to the handful that could be completed by hand methods. The firing technology also advanced progressively. Open-pit firing achieved temperatures adequate for basic pottery but produced inconsistent results. Some vessels would be underfired and porous, others overfired and brittle. The development of kilns, enclosed structures that could maintain higher and more consistent temperatures, enabled the production of harder, more durable ceramics. Evidence for specialized kilns appears in the archaeological record by the Ubaid period, indicating both technological sophistication and the existence of specialist potters producing for wider markets. These developments in ceramic technology exemplify the broader pattern of pre-Sumerian technological development. Each innovation built upon previous achievements. Each represented accumulated knowledge transmitted across generations. The potters of Uruk did not reinvent their craft from scratch. They inherited techniques developed over 3,000 years of experimentation and refinement, and they in turn passed on improved methods to their successors. The process was continuous, without the rupture that a civilization-destroying flood would have required. The burial practices of pre-Sumerian societies offer intimate glimpses into beliefs about death, afterlife, and the relationship between the living and the dead. At Çatalhöyük, the dead were buried beneath the floors of houses, literally remaining with their families even after death. Skulls were sometimes removed from buried bodies, plastered and painted to restore the features of the face, and kept in circulation among the living for periods before final reburial. These practices suggest a conception of death, not as final separation but as transformation, with the dead continuing to participate in the life of the community through their material remains. Similar practices appear at other Neolithic sites across the Near East. At Ain Ghazal in Jordan, plaster statues with elaborate features may represent ancestors or supernatural beings. The interpretation remains debate. At Jericho, plastered skulls similar to those from Çatalhöyük were discovered in contexts suggesting both individual commemoration and collective ritual. The widespread distribution of these practices across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers suggests shared beliefs transmitted through cultural contact and perhaps population movement. The burial practices of the Ubaid period show both continuity with earlier traditions and new developments reflecting emerging social hierarchy. Graves were typically located within or near settlements, maintaining the connection between the living and the dead that characterized earlier periods. But variations in burial goods, pottery vessels, personal ornaments, copper objects, suggest that some individuals were accorded different treatment in death than others. The emergence of these distinctions parallels the broader trend towards social stratification during the later Ubaid period. The royal cemetery of Ur, dating to the early dynastic period following the emergence of Sumerian civilization, represents a dramatic intensification of these trends. The tombs excavated by Leonard Woolley contain not only extraordinary wealth, gold vessels, lapis lazuli jewellery, musical instruments, but also evidence of human sacrifice, with attendants apparently killed to accompany their masters to the afterlife. These practices represent a profound development from the relatively egalitarian mortuary traditions of earlier periods, reflecting the concentration of power and the elaboration of ideology that accompanied urban civilization. The evolution of burial practices across these millennia demonstrates again the pattern of gradual development rather than sudden change. Beliefs about death and afterlife evolved continuously, incorporating new elements while maintaining connections to older traditions. The dead were never abandoned, never forgotten, never left without ritual attention, evidence that cultural traditions persisted across generations even as they adapted to changing social circumstances. The environmental conditions of southern Mesopotamia shaped human development throughout the pre-Sumerian period and continue to influence scholarship today. The region's extreme aridity made agriculture dependent on irrigation, but also contributed to excellent preservation of archaeological materials. Mud brick structures that would have dissolved within decades in wetter climates have survived for millennia in the dry conditions of the Iraqi south. Organic materials, wooden objects, reed baskets, textiles decompose rapidly, but clay tablets once fired remain essentially permanent, preserving the administrative records that constitute our primary written sources. The geological processes that built the Mesopotamian plain also affected the archaeological record in significant ways. The annual floods of the Tigris and Euphrates deposited layers of silt across the floodplain, gradually burying ancient settlements beneath meters of accumulated sediment. Sites that were once on the riverbank now lie far from the modern channels. Entire cities have been lost beneath alluvial deposits or obliterated by the shifting courses of rivers that carve new channels across the landscape. These geological factors help explain why evidence for the earliest phases of Mesopotamian settlement remains relatively sparse. The oldest sites lie deepest, buried beneath thousands of years of accumulation and often below the modern water table. Excavating to such depths requires massive investment of time and resources, and the waterlogged conditions make preservation problematic. It is entirely possible that sites older than Tel el-Awali exist in southern Mesopotamia, but remain undiscovered simply because they lie too deep for current archaeological methods to reach economically. The environmental constraints of Mesopotamia also shaped the development of writing and record-keeping. Clay was abundant and cheap. The alluvial plains offered essentially unlimited supplies of the raw material for tablets. Other potential writing surfaces, papyrus, parchment, bark, wood, were either unavailable or poorly suited to the climate. The choice of clay as a writing medium had profound consequences for the preservation of Mesopotamian literature and records, ensuring that far more survives from Mesopotamia than from contemporary cultures that may have written extensively on perishable materials. The religious beliefs of pre-Sumerian societies can be reconstructed only tentatively from material remains, but certain patterns emerge consistently across sites and periods. The veneration of animals, particularly wild animals of power and mystery, appears prominently in the iconography of Göbekli Tepe and continues through later periods. The bull, the lion, the serpent, the scorpion, these creatures appear repeatedly in contexts that suggest symbolic significance beyond their practical importance as predators or prey. The emergence of temples as the central institutions of Mesopotamian communities suggests that religion played an increasingly important role in social organization during the Ubaid period. The temples at Eridu grew progressively larger and more elaborate over centuries, commanding resources that could only have been mobilized through religious authority or obligation. The standardized architecture of Ubaid temples, rectangular rooms on raised platforms with offering tables and cult niches, suggests a shared religious tradition across the Ubaid world maintained and transmitted by religious specialists. By the Uruk period, temples had become economic powerhouses, managing agricultural estates, employing craftsmen, conducting trade, and administering the distribution of goods to workers and dependents. The religious ideology that supported these institutions cast the temple as the household of the god, with the god as owner of the land and people as tenants or servants. This ideology justified the extraction of agricultural surplus as offerings to the deity and the concentration of wealth in temple storerooms as divine property. The flood myths themselves may be understood as products of this religious environment. The gods of Mesopotamian theology were powerful but capricious, capable of tremendous beneficence, but also terrible wrath. The story of the flood expressed fundamental truths about the divine-human relationship, that the gods had created humanity and could destroy it, that human survival depended on divine favour, that proper worship and obedience were essential for continued existence. The flood hero's survival was not a matter of his own power or cleverness, but of divine grace, granted because he had found favour with one member of the divine assembly who warned him of the coming destruction. As we conclude this examination of the millennia between the Ice Age and Sumerian civilization, it is worth reflecting on what the evidence reveals about human potential and human achievement. Without modern tools, without metal stronger than copper, without writing, without any of the technologies we consider essential to complex society, human communities transformed themselves from scattered bands of hunter-gatherers into the builders of cities and the inventors of civilization. The transformation was not inevitable. Other regions of the world developed along different trajectories, some achieving urban civilization centuries or millennia later, others never developing it at all before contact with expanding civilizations from abroad. The particular conditions of the Near East, the availability of domesticable plants and animals, the environmental pressures that encouraged sedentism, the geographic connections that facilitated cultural exchange, combined to create a uniquely favourable environment for the developments that occurred there. Different conditions elsewhere produced different outcomes. But the human capacities that made civilization possible were not unique to the Near East. The creativity, the problem-solving ability, the capacity for cooperation and organization that built Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük, that invented irrigation and writing, that founded the first cities, these are universal human characteristics, shared by all peoples and available to be expressed wherever conditions permit. The story of pre-Sumerian development is thus not just the story of one particular region, but a testament to what humanity as a whole is capable of achieving. The flood myths of the Near East persist because they speak to enduring human concerns, our vulnerability before the forces of nature, our dependence on powers beyond our control, our hope that somehow, despite all disasters, we and our civilization will endure. The archaeological record provides a different kind of reassurance, evidence that human ingenuity has repeatedly overcome challenges that might have seemed insurmountable, that each generation has built upon the achievements of its predecessors, that the cumulative efforts of countless individuals across countless generations have produced the world we inhabit today. Both the myths and the archaeology have truths to teach us. The myths remind us of humility, of the limits of human power, of the need to respect forces greater than ourselves. The archaeology reminds us of capacity, of the remarkable achievements of our ancestors, of the potential within human communities to adapt, innovate, and create. Together, they offer a fuller picture of the human condition than either could provide alone. The 6,000 years between the Ice Age and Sumer were years of transformation unprecedented in human history. They were not years of waiting for civilization to recover from flood-wrought destruction. They were years of active creation, of building and learning and passing knowledge to the next generation. The cities that emerged at their end, Uruk and Ur and Eridu and all the rest, were not phoenix-like resurrections from catastrophe, but culminations of a long developmental process, the flowering of seeds planted by countless unknown innovators across millennia of human striving. The silent centuries speak clearly to those who know how to listen. Their message echoes through temple foundations and pottery fragments, through burial offerings and irrigation channels, through the first tentative marks on clay that would become writing, and through the great cities that arose, where once there had been only marsh and desert. It is a message of hope and resilience, of human creativity in the face of challenges, of the long arc of development that brought us from hunting and gathering to the threshold of history. The story does not end here. The civilizations that emerged from these formative millennia would flourish and fall, their achievements preserved in ruins and tablets, and the memories of their successors. New catastrophes would come, wars and conquests, climate shifts and environmental degradation, the slow decline of cities and the loss of knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate. But always somewhere, human communities would persist, adapt, and begin again to build. The flood may or may not have happened as the myths describe, but the rising from the waters, that is documented, that is real, that is the story these silent millennia tell. And it is a story worth knowing. A story that connects us to our deepest past and illuminates the foundations upon which everything since has been built.